Hi there! Here is the promised episode on Gothic literature to provide something of a background to our discussion of Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. I'm going to give you an introduction to the genre, and you'll undoubtedly walk away with a long reading list if you're into it. So, welcome aboard the International Express to Book Central. Grab a seat, settle in, and let's while away the journey with some book chat. I'm your host Jules, and let's get Gothic. Let's just dive straight into it. I will say that the Gothic, whatever that might mean, we might have an answer to that towards the end, is one of my favorite genres. I have read a lot of the books that are foundational Gothic texts, let's say. I've read a lot of modern Gothic novels as well, and it's just such a rich, broad genre that there is an endless amount of things to talk about, really. But what I mainly want to do is give you an introduction to it, so that for those of you who aren't maybe as comfortable with ideas of the Gothic or using the term or figuring out maybe what belongs to the Gothic genre, that you have a couple of handholds to maybe be more comfortable in that conversation. I'm also going to throw an endless amount of book titles at you, most likely. So, like I said at the beginning, a reading list may emerge from this. What I'm going to start with is a little bit of a theoretical, perhaps, discussion. I've read a couple of books or went back to a couple of academic volumes to maybe get a handhold, a couple of definitions that we could use, and then we're just going to dive into the history of it. What was perhaps the first Gothic novel? How did the genre emerge? What kind of differences exist? And what are some of the most common tropes? So let's get into it. So I tried to think of a clear definition for the Gothic genre, but to be entirely honest, I don't think that it's possible to really just have one definition for any literary genre, because the whole point of writing is that authors do their own thing with it, right? They pick up old motifs, reuse them, reinvent them, add new details, so that most genres that still exist at least, are constantly developing and changing. But I did find one thing that Angela Carter wrote in her collection of essays, Burning Your Boats. She said that the Gothic's, quote, singular moral function is that of provoking unease, end quote. And I think that is true. I think if there is one thing that a Gothic novel is meant to do, regardless of when it is set, where it is set, when it was written, it's meant to make you feel uneasy. It is meant to perhaps disturb some of your assumptions about life, to make you wonder what is behind that corner, if something is lurking in the shadows, if everything is truly as it seems. And because of that, I think the Gothic is also an excellent genre to explore trauma. And I think that is what most Gothic novels do. There is always an underlying unease, a worry about things that might have happened in the past that you now need to deal with in the present because it's come back to haunt you. Whether that is literally in the form of like a ghost or a vampire, or more implicitly through difficult family dynamics. And that also brings us to one of the key defining elements, I would say, of the Gothic genre, which is its engagement with the past. So the term Gothic itself emerged from a kind of pejorative term that was used in the Renaissance to refer to the Middle Ages, to barbarians, specifically to Gothic architecture, which was built in the late Middle Ages, high to late, I would say. And from there, of course, it refers back to the people of the Goths. And the Goths were involved in the fall of Rome and in the start of sort of the period we now call the Middle Ages, right? So already there with the fall of the Roman Empire, we have this idea of disaster, collapse, civilizational disorder, and out of that chaos emerges something new, something different. And I think that sort of engagement with what is the past, what happened there, how does that still affect us today? We see that a lot, especially in the early Gothic novels when it comes to the Middle Ages. So a key defining trait of Gothic literature, especially in the Victorian era and briefly before that in the end of the Georgian literary era, is ruined castles, knights, legends, ghosts, witches, maybe even werewolves and vampires, all of those kind of old ancient things that might have previously lurked in the dark, and now that we are in an enlightened age, they come back to haunt us. Right? So there we see that engagement. I've just realized I'm throwing around literary era terms without maybe clarifying those. So the Georgian era of literature roughly goes from the beginning of the 1700s to the first third of the 1800s. And then Victorian literature itself, which followed it, is aligned with the reign of Queen Victoria in England, and that was from 1837 to 1901. So those are sort of the eras in which we're operating. During the Georgian era, there was also a lot of romanticism, this inspiration from the landscape, individual genius, and all of that came together to create the Gothic, especially in England, which is where we might say some of those biggest novels that formed the genre emerged. So we have a deep engagement with the past, not necessarily with the historical past, that's important to say, but the ideas of the past. England, or Great Britain, the British Empire, was spreading, establishing itself as a modern-ish nation empire force in the world. And at the same time as the world was being explored, as more of it became mapped, almost literally, as the globe was filled in, as everything became more clear, there was sort of this void, but also this uncertainty about the past, where things were going. And I think that is sort of an insecurity where the Gothic novel slipped in and started bringing all these things from the past back into the present. There we already have some of our key defining features. We have an engagement with the past. We have a reemergence of that past. We have broken down things, be they broken down houses, broken down relationships, broken down states, societies. And we have this idea of unease. And those, I think, were elemental to the Gothic genre from the beginning. But what makes the Gothic so amazing is that it keeps reinventing itself. And here I found a really good quote from Julian Wolfreys in his preface to an edited volume called Victorian Gothic. And there he says, quote, "The Gothic becomes truly haunting in that it can never be pinned down as a single identity, while it returns through various apparitions and manifestations, seemingly everywhere." So the Gothic itself is almost like a monster that keeps returning at the end of the film, right? We've all seen these films where we think the serial killer or the monster is dead, and then the last shot is it opening its eyes again. The monster always returns, as Geoffrey Jerome Cohen said. And the Gothic, similarly, which is so deeply connected to ideas of the monstrous already, also consistently returns. So in its modern iterations, for example, Southern Gothic, we see a similar engagement with the past, but here it's not a medieval past. It's often an engagement with Southern American history, and then I mean the South of the United States, so engagements with slavery, the Civil War, Jim Crow era rules. All of those things are picked up again, and the Gothic returns by doing so. And that's why the genre has such a long life, because it's always going back to things, but bringing them into a new modern light, reassessing, rethinking. So that's how we should think of the Gothic. Something that explores historic traumas, that is meant to make you feel uneasy, and therefore it also plays with elements of terror and horror, and it can feel a bit schlocky. And that's the other thing to know about the Gothic genre, is that it's very often lambasted. There is always something of it's a Gothic novel, a kind of pejorative tone when it comes to it. And this was true for the earliest Gothic novels. While they were incredibly popular, they were also looked down upon a little bit as perhaps not real literature. And we saw this, of course, in Northanger Abbey, where our heroine, Catherine, she's reading these Gothic novels, and they are so full of these exciting, terrifying things that, well, what is that doing to the minds of our young people? Shouldn't they be reading real books instead of these Gothic novels, right? So there's always been this question mark around the genre, sort of, is this good? Is this actually literature? Is this enriching? Is it edifying? And much of that has to do with the fact that it deals with fantastical, scary things. But what you really need to do with the genre is read through those. On the one hand, you should enjoy all the drama that these Gothic novels throw at you, but the whole point of it is also to re-engage with the past, right? And to gain new insight into what has gone before through these books. So if we think of, for example, a modern book like Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno-Garcia, which came out in 2020, this is an engagement with, on the one hand, all these delightful aspects of the Gothic. We've got a crumbling mansion, we've got a woman in danger who needs to be rescued, and we've got an updated element to that, which is that it's perhaps another woman who goes out to save the damsel in distress rather than a man. And rather than being set in Europe, it is set in Mexico City and in Mexico's countryside as well. And it's therefore an engagement with, well, Mexico's history of colonialism, imperialism, of working class exploitation, the patriarchy. It's always a genre that engages with important themes, and you should always bear that in mind when you read a Gothic novel. Okay, so we've got a bit of a broad conversation going on here. We've got this unease, we've got a consistent return and reinvention, we've got dilapidated buildings, we've got scary things, monsters, and that is what makes up some of the Gothic. But it's also worth knowing where the Gothic started. And the first novel that called itself a Gothic story was The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole, which was published in 1764. And that is often seen as the starting point of the Gothic genre. So, for example, Carol Margaret Davison has also written a book called The History of Gothic Literature, and she starts it in 1764 until 1824. Horace Walpole may have started us off here. Of course, nothing is created out of nothing. Everything has its sources of inspiration, and from what I've read, authors and playwrights like Shakespeare, Milton, etc., they were all very important to creating the necessary ideas and base material, which was then crystallized into a Gothic story. Now, in The Castle of Otranto, we have a lot already of the key trademarks of Gothic literature. We've got a dilapidated castle. We've got a woman in distress, a woman who's being sort of hunted by men. And we've got questions of inheritances. We've got curses that haunt a family. These might appear through ghosts. We have questionable sort of sexual elements, which are a little bit titillating. And we've got a lot of countryside and landscape that gets described as well. So Gothic literature is quite full, in my personal experience at least, of what we call pathetic fallacy, where the weather symbolizes the emotional state. So while there's a thunderstorm outside, it's also storming inside our protagonist as they're trying to figure things out. Now, another person who is very important is an author who is also mentioned in Northanger Abbey, and that is Anne Radcliffe, sometimes Anne Ward Radcliffe. And the novel of hers that gets mentioned the most in Northanger Abbey is The Mysteries of Udolpho, which, if you would guessed it, also features a young woman who is in distress and ruined castles and weird family relationships, which also seem to veer into the weirdly sexual. And that was truly one of the most popular novels. So I'm going to do a tiny digression into Anne Radcliffe here. She was born in 1764 and died in 1823. And she wrote 5 novels, or she wrote 6, but 5 novels were published during her lifetime. And she published and wrote all of these between 1789 and 1797, which means that she was a very productive woman. But after 1797, she then sort of became a recluse, lived mostly privately without publishing anything more. But she made a lot of money from her writing in those couple of years. So I mentioned in the episode on Northanger Abbey that the rights for it were bought by the publisher for £10, which feels like nothing these days, but was actually quite significant for the time. Now, Anne Radcliffe, for Udolpho, was given £500 for the rights to the book. right? So if we just compare that, £10 to £500, we can tell how incredibly popular and in high demand Anne Radcliffe was. And she got even more, £800 for The Italian, which was her book afterwards. So Anne Radcliffe was foundational to the Gothic genre, but so were other people. We also have Matthew Gregory Lewis, who wrote The Monk in 1796, and he really upped the salaciousness of the Gothic genre. I think that's fair to say. I have only read excerpts of The Monk. I've never made it through the entire thing, but it definitely is more violent. It's more weirdly sexual as well. And what was nice about all of these authors roughly writing around the same time is that they responded to one another. So Anne Radcliffe also wrote an essay. In this essay, she comments upon the difference between the kind of Gothic novels that she is writing and the kinds that Lewis was writing. And I'm going to quote you a little bit from it, and I'll remember to link the essay in the notes as well. What she says, quote, "Terror and horror are so far opposite that the first expands the soul and awakens the faculties to a high degree of life. The other contracts, freezes, and nearly annihilates them." And for her, terror, end quote, for her, terror is about uncertainty and obscurity, whereas horror is more explicit. So Anne Radcliffe is kind of arguing for terror, that feeling of unease, of something is there, but I don't know what it is. She's arguing for that and somewhat against the horror she saw in the writing of Lewis and others, where it's not a what is there, but more of an oh my god, it is here, sort of face to face with horrible, scary things. And she's like, well, if you suggest these things, if you make people feel terror rather than horror, it expands their awareness. It makes them think critically, maybe, about what they see, about what they read. And that way, they're not scared out of their wits, but they might actually learn something from it. So we had a lot of different things going on there in the 18th century towards the end of it. But of course, the genre did not end there, otherwise we wouldn't be having this conversation. A key Gothic text is, of course, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. We are all, I think, familiar with, at the very least, the basics of Frankenstein, in which Victor Frankenstein creates a creature and brings him to life, and then things go horribly wrong from there. There were different versions of this published. The final edited version is from 1818, and it's a key text for the Gothic genre because it also features the landscape, pathetic fallacy, not necessarily a woman in distress as a main character, but almost every woman who's in that book is in some form of distress, and so is our main protagonist, a man who has to face what he has done. Whether he does so is up for debate. But throughout the 19th century, plenty of authors engaged with elements of the Gothic. Charles Dickens did so. Eliot, Tennyson, Hardy, I've seen all of those authors mentioned in relation to that. Of course, the Bronte sisters dealt with the Gothic. I mean, we have a literal madwoman in the attic. We have the past coming to haunt us, a past that is also related to colonialism if you keep reading. All of that plays into the Gothic genre. It's also no surprise that Mr. Rochester's hall is burned down in a ruin towards the end, right? A couple of other key texts of the Gothic genre that emerged in the 19th century was Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu, which is a key vampire story, one of the earliest ones, and it features a female vampire and sort of queer romance aspects, which in many ways is also crucial to the Gothic genre. I've already mentioned here and there sort of these sexual elements to the genre where there is perhaps forbidden lust, there is desire, there is romance that cannot take place, romance that is perhaps questionable when it comes to social mores, and queer desire is also a part of that. Not always a negative part, is important to say. So we have Carmilla, and I have done an episode on Carmilla a while back, so I'll try and remember to link that. In 1886, we had Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, and this is such a funny book to read now because we all know the twist of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But, well, if you read the book, and you know what happens, it feels like you're forever just waiting for it to be revealed. And when it is revealed, you're like, yeah, obviously we all knew this, right? But I just try and imagine what it was like to read that book when that reveal, that twist wasn't general public knowledge, and it must have blown minds. But there too, we have this concern about knowledge, about wisdom, and about sort of deep hidden secrets inside. So there, the past that we're engaging with is not so much a medieval past or a long distant temporal past. It's more like what is inside of us, right? What kind of traits do we have? And so Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde engages really deeply with class issues, for example. There is, of course, also the perhaps most famous vampire book, Dracula, by Bram Stoker from 1897. And there too, that is a text that is so deeply familiar to all of pop culture that reading it is quite fun. But of course, most adaptations don't actually retain the structure of the book, so reading it is an absolute recommendation on my part. But that brings us to another element I find really interesting about the Gothic, which is how many Gothic novels from the past 2-3 centuries are foundational to popular culture. They've given us our most important monsters, ways of talking about things, metaphors and tropes that are so common now that it's almost easy to forget that they were once new and shocking, right? The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde is also a Gothic novel because it also plays with this element of terror and class again, but also sexuality and sin and what is hidden behind those corners that we don't want to show. So the Gothic is a genre that has been going for quite a while, and it keeps being reinvented. I've already mentioned Angela Carter, but then also Silvia Moreno-Garcia, who keeps writing in that genre, and it keeps being reinvented over and over again. And further recommendations there would be Shirley Jackson, but also Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, Anne Rice, of course. I mean, I don't know who's currently been watching The Vampire Lestat. We're about to get Queen of the Damned, and I'm so excited. But she was deeply embedded in the Gothic, right? And I've seen comments upon her novels, which admittedly I haven't read myself yet, mainly because there's quite a few and I don't know where to start. But her novels are Gothic in the sense that they push all kinds of boundaries, right? And when you're dealing with vampires, of course, you can dive back into that past because they've got an endless past. But there too, we see all these elements of gender, of race, of class, of confused approaches to life, queer sexuality. All of these aspects come into it while we're in this sort of haunted world, right? It's not just a genre for sort of white Europeans or white Americans. I've already mentioned Silvia Moreno-Garcia, but there is also Toni Morrison, who works with aspects of the Gothic in her books. And I think in current Gothic writing, there is a lot of exploration of, again, colonialism, imperialism, the impacts that has had. And I therefore find it a very important genre that is so intriguing to just dive into. And that would really be my recommendation from this episode, that you just try a couple out if you haven't yet. And I think it really pays off a lot to read some of the early texts, some of the modern texts, and to compare and contrast and to kind of see what remains, what changes. And what I find really interesting as a kind of final point here is that also when we consider the Gothic in the light of Northanger Abbey, right, which was the inspiration for this episode, the genre seems to start out with women in danger. There is always a young, beautiful, virginal protagonist who has to be saved from the horrors of the past, from the horrors that are being enacted by men mostly. And then, of course, the one who saves her is also a man. But many of the key authors, not all, but many of the key authors of this genre are female authors. And in many of the more modern Gothic texts I feel that I've read, there is a real emphasis on female agency, female autonomy, and that remains threatened in the books. You know, there is almost always something threatening the well-being of a main female character, but it turns into something that either she defeats or takes on. And that is also a really interesting development of the genre, I feel. So here I'm thinking, for example, also of Johanna von Vane's books, Blood on Her Tongue, for example, which always play with that part of like, okay, so the Gothic, we used to fear the past. We used to fear the vampire, the ghost, the witch, the family curse, the crumbling family estate. But maybe there's power in taking that on board, right? In not just facing the terror and moving through it, but embodying some of it, becoming slightly scary yourself. And I find that a really interesting development in the genre as I currently see it. Of course, other people can have different opinions on that. But where before the sort of terror and the past needed to be confronted, but in order to put that past to rest, to move on from it, and to maybe also not look too closely at what was actually going on, nowadays we're really diving into it and we are sitting with the unease. And I think that is because of non-European, non-American authors, non-white authors really dealing with it. Because those earlier Gothic novels, those by Anne Radcliffe, Walpole, Lewis, they were always set outside of England, right? They were writing from an England that they felt was civilized and harmonious. And they were then looking at mostly Southern Europe, Italy, and parts of France and stuff, and going, well, that is weird country. That is where the past is still more alive, and that's why scary things can happen there. And we even have Henry Tilney say that literally to Catherine in Northanger Abbey, where he's like, I know you read a lot of Gothic novels and you think my father is weird, but this is England. We have laws here. The things that happen in Gothic novels and in the rest of Europe could never happen here in England. And I think modern Gothic novels are really bringing that terror to the places that consider themselves highly civilized. They are confronting hegemonic cultures, one could almost say, with their own pasts and saying, you may think the horrors and the terrors are taking place in our countries, but you are the ones who brought them here and you are the ones who are taking them home with you. And I think that's what makes it so good and so interesting. So let me have a look through my notes. Is there anything that I've missed that I wanted to mention? Well, I think you've got a couple of recommendations there. Hopefully you have something of an idea of what might be implied by the Gothic. A last thing that I would love to refer you to is the Handbook of the Gothic, edited by Marie Mulvey-Roberts. This is a true handbook in the best of ways. So it begins with writers of the Gothic, so it traces important authors, again, like the Brontes, but also Angela Carter that I mentioned, Susan Hill, of course, Lovecraft, who we haven't mentioned at all, but we also did an episode on that, authors like Edgar Allan Poe, etc. But it also gives you an overview of important themes, concepts, and contexts is what that section is called. So we have an engagement with colonial Gothic, the golem, the demon, the Gothic body, like how important physicality is, but also, let's see what else they've got here. I'm just going to scroll through. Well, it's got an entire chapter. The chapters are like a page each because it's a handbook on the Northanger novels. So the Gothic novels that get mentioned in Northanger Abbey, of course, Orientalism, Penny Dreadfuls, where if you want to imbibe some Gothic that is not literary but visual, by all means watch Penny Dreadful. It's one of the best shows, and I'm so sad that it's over, but I'm also glad that they didn't stretch it out, if that makes sense. Anyway, in that handbook, you can find introductions to every important element of it, be it witches, werewolves, vampires, the uncanny, what that means, the abject. And it also talks about locations. So where the Gothic is set and how that changes things. So there we've got Southern Gothic, of course, but also Australian Gothic, German Gothic, Anglo-Caribbean, and all of that. And it's got a delightful list of further reading and also websites that you can visit. So parts of that book are accessible on Google Books if you want to have a look. But otherwise, your library might have it. And I can only recommend that you have a look and dive more deeply into it, because the Gothic is a deeply fascinating genre. It's a genre that's always developing. It's a genre that will make you feel uneasy, but that is the point. Sometimes it's good to sit with discomfort and unease. And I think many genres especially nowadays in publishing, where there is, from higher up, I would say, less than from the readers themselves, this emphasis on marketability, on consumption, on reading as much, as quickly, as often as possible. Having a genre that makes that process more difficult, that makes you feel uncomfortable and uneasy and makes you ask questions that maybe you'd prefer not to have to ask or to have answered. I think that is so important, and that is why the Gothic is good and the Gothic is alive. So, I hope that this has been interesting, that you've got a little bit of an idea of what I at least mean when I talk about the Gothic. And if you have any questions or anything else, let me know. And that's it for today. If you have questions, thoughts on the book, or recommendations or requests for future episodes, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email at bookcentralpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. You can also subscribe to be informed when new episodes drop. You can find references to the materials used today in the description. Book Central is written and produced by me, and our music is by Scott Buckley. Thank you for joining me today on the International Express to Book Central.